A bleeding bobcat crouched on Martha's doorstep at dawn, a dying kitten hanging limp from her jaws, refusing to move even as two house cats pressed against the glass in stunned silence. When the wild mother's golden eyes locked onto Martha's face, she understood with terrible clarity that this creature had come to beg for something no animal should know how to ask for. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The Appalachian Mountains of eastern Tennessee hold secrets that most people will never understand. Hidden among the rolling hills and dense hardwood forests, where civilization meets wilderness in an uneasy truce, nature plays out dramas that defy everything we think we know about the animal kingdom. This is a story about one such drama, a tale so extraordinary that those who witnessed it still struggle to explain what they saw. It began on a cold November morning, on the weathered porch of a farmhouse that had stood for over a century, when a desperate mother made a choice that would change multiple lives forever. Martha Jennings had lived alone on her family's property for 12 years, ever since her husband passed from a heart attack while tending to the apple orchard that still stood behind the house. At 67 years old, she had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of rural life, her only companions being two house cats she had rescued from the shelter in town. Whiskers, an orange tabby with a perpetually suspicious expression, had been with her for 8 years. Shadow, a sleek black cat with emerald eyes, had arrived 5 years ago, abandoned on the side of Route 411 during a thunderstorm. Together, the three of them had formed an unlikely family, bound by routine and the simple comfort of shared space. The farmhouse itself was showing its age, much like Martha. The white paint on the wooden siding had begun to peel and crack, revealing layers of history beneath. The porch boards creaked with every step, and the screen door had long since been replaced with a solid wooden one that Martha kept meaning to fix. But there was a warmth to the place that no amount of weathering could diminish, a sense of home that radiated from every corner. Martha's late husband had always said that houses absorbed the love of those who lived in them, and this house had absorbed plenty over the generations. That November morning started like any other. Martha woke before dawn, as she always did, her internal clock stubbornly refusing to acknowledge retirement. She made her coffee in the old percolator that had belonged to her mother, listening to the familiar gurgling sounds that had greeted every morning of her childhood. Whiskers and Shadow wound around her ankles, their morning ritual of demanding breakfast playing out with practiced precision. She fed them their kibble, topped off their water bowl, and settled into her favorite chair by the window to watch the sun rise over the mountains. The first hint that something was wrong came from Shadow. The black cat had jumped onto the windowsill beside Martha's chair, as she did every morning, but instead of settling into her usual pose of dignified observation, she stood rigid, her tail puffed to twice its normal size. A low growl rumbled from her throat, a sound Martha had never heard her make in 5 years of companionship. Whiskers, sensing his companion's distress, abandoned his breakfast bowl and joined her at the window, his own body language shifting from relaxed to alert in an instant. Martha leaned forward, squinting through the glass at the front porch. The morning light was still dim, casting long shadows across the weathered boards, but she could make out a shape near the door. Her first thought was that a raccoon had gotten into the garbage again, a common enough occurrence in these parts. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized that what she was looking at was far larger than any raccoon and far more unexpected. A bobcat crouched on her porch not 3 feet from the door. Its spotted coat was matted and dirty, its body showing the unmistakable heaviness of advanced pregnancy. But what made Martha's breath catch in her throat was what the creature held in its mouth, a tiny kitten, barely larger than Martha's fist, hanging limp and motionless from the bobcat's gentle grip. The kitten's fur was pale, almost white, a stark contrast to its mother's wild markings. And even from this distance, Martha could see that something was terribly wrong with the small creature. For a long moment, nobody moved. Martha sat frozen in her chair, coffee cup suspended halfway to her lips. Whiskers and Shadow pressed against the glass, their earlier alarm giving way to something that looked almost like recognition. and the bobcat simply waited, her golden eyes fixed on the door with an intensity that seemed almost human in its desperation. Martha had lived in these mountains her entire life. She knew bobcats were common in the area, had seen them from a distance on countless occasions. But in 67 years, she had never once seen a wild bobcat approach a human dwelling, let alone sit on someone's porch as if waiting to be invited in. The kitten in the bobcat's mouth twitched, a small movement that sent a jolt through Martha's chest. The little thing was alive, but barely. She could see now that its breathing was shallow and irregular, its tiny body struggling with each breath. The mother bobcat shifted her weight, adjusting her grip on her offspring with heartbreaking gentleness, and that's when Martha noticed the blood. Dark stains marked the bobcat's belly and hind legs, and a small trail of crimson drops led from the porch steps to where she now crouched. This animal was injured, possibly seriously, and she had brought her dying kitten to the one place she thought might offer help. Martha set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. Every instinct told her that what she was about to do was foolish, perhaps even dangerous. Wild animals were unpredictable, and a mother protecting her young was the most unpredictable of all. But there was something in those golden eyes, something that transcended the usual boundaries between wild and domestic, predator and prey. This creature was asking for help in the only way she knew how, and Martha Jennings had never been able to turn away from any animal in need. She rose slowly from her chair, her joints protesting the sudden movement after sitting so long. Whiskers and Shadow watched her with expressions that seemed to convey both warning and encouragement, their own instincts warring with something deeper that they couldn't quite understand. Martha approached the door, her heart pounding against her ribs, and reached for the handle. The bobcat's eyes never left hers, and in that moment, an understanding passed between them that needed no words. Whatever happened next, they were in it together. The door swung open with a familiar creak, and the cold November air rushed in to meet Martha's face. She stood in the doorway, her worn cardigan offering little protection against the morning chill, and looked down at the creature that had come seeking help. Up close, the bobcat was even more magnificent than she had appeared through the window, her spotted coat a masterwork of nature's design despite its current state of disarray. But it was the desperation in those golden eyes that held Martha's attention, a raw and primal plea that transcended species and spoke directly to something ancient in the human heart. The kitten hung motionless in its mother's jaws, and Martha could now see the full extent of its distress. The tiny creature's breathing had become even more labored in the few minutes since she had first spotted it, each breath a visible struggle that shook its fragile body. Its pale fur was tinged with an unhealthy grayish hue, and its eyes remained closed, too weak even to open and take in the world around it. Martha had raised enough animals in her lifetime to recognize the signs. This kitten was dying, slipping away with each passing moment, and its mother knew it. Behind her, Whiskers and Shadow had crept to the edge of the doorway, their curiosity overcoming their initial fear. The orange tabby stretched his neck forward, sniffing the air with intense concentration, while Shadow hung back slightly, her green eyes wide and watchful. Neither cat made any aggressive moves toward the wild intruder, and the bobcat, for her part, seemed to register their presence without concern. In this moment, the usual rules of the animal kingdom had been suspended, replaced by something none of them quite understood. Martha lowered herself slowly to her knees, ignoring the protest of her aging joints against the cold wooden boards. She extended one weathered hand, palm up, in the universal gesture of peaceful intention. The bobcat watched her movement with alert eyes but did not retreat. Instead, she took a careful step forward, closing the distance between them to barely a foot. Martha could smell the wild scent of her now, earth and pine and something metallic that she recognized as blood. The wounds on the bobcat's body were more apparent at this distance, deep scratches across her hindquarters that spoke of a violent encounter. "What happened to you, Mama?" Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning bird song. The bobcat made a sound in response, a soft chirping noise that seemed impossibly gentle coming from such a powerful predator. Then, with a movement that Martha would replay in her mind for years to come, the the wildcat stepped forward and carefully, deliberately, placed the dying kitten at Martha's knees. The message was unmistakable. She was entrusting her offspring to human hands, abandoning every instinct that should have kept her from such an act. Martha's throat tightened as she looked down at the tiny creature now lying on the porch boards before her. The kitten was even smaller than she had realized, probably the runt of its litter, its body barely larger than a tennis ball. Its breathing had grown so shallow that Martha had to watch closely to confirm it was still alive at all. She reached down with trembling fingers and gently lifted the small body, cradling it against her chest where her own heartbeat might offer some comfort. The kitten was cold, far too cold for a living creature, and Martha knew that time was running out. She looked up at the mother bobcat, who had settled back on her haunches and was watching with an intensity that bordered on human. There were more kittens somewhere, Martha realized. This was just one, probably the weakest, the one that had needed the most help. The scratches on the mother's body suddenly made terrible sense. Something had attacked her den, threatened her family, and in the chaos of escape or defense, this smallest kitten had suffered. Now the mother had made an impossible choice, bringing the one she could not save to the strange creatures who lived in the wooden den, hoping they might succeed where she had failed. The weight of that trust settled over Martha like a physical thing. She had been chosen for this, selected by an intelligence she did not fully understand to play a role in a drama that had been unfolding in the wild places around her home. She thought of all the years she had lived on this land, all the mornings she had watched the sun rise over the mountains, all the nights she had listened to the sounds of creatures moving through the darkness. She had always considered herself a part of this landscape, but she had never truly been invited into its deepest stories until now. Martha rose carefully to her feet, the kitten still pressed against her chest. The bobcat rose with her, maintaining that intense, watchful gaze. For a moment, they stood facing each other across the threshold between wild and domestic, two mothers united by circumstances neither could have predicted. Then Martha stepped back into the warmth of her house, and the bobcat followed. It was such a simple thing, a wild animal crossing a doorway, but Martha understood that something profound had just occurred. The boundaries that had kept their worlds separate had been breached, not through force or accident, but through an act of desperate faith. Whiskers and shadows scattered as the bobcat entered, retreating to their favorite hiding spots beneath the furniture. But they did not flee the room entirely, and Martha noticed that their eyes held more curiosity than fear. The bobcat paid them little attention, her focus remaining fixed on the small bundle in Martha's arms. She followed as Martha moved through the living room toward the kitchen, her spotted form incongruous against the domestic backdrop of worn furniture and family photographs. On the mantel, a picture of Martha's late husband seemed to watch the strange procession with benevolent amusement, and Martha could almost hear his voice telling her that she had finally lost her mind completely. The kitchen was warmer than the rest of the house, heated by the old wood stove that Martha kept burning through the cold months. She grabbed a clean dish towel from the drawer and wrapped it around the kitten, trying to transfer some warmth to the tiny body. The creature stirred slightly at the touch, a small movement that sent a surge of hope through Martha's chest. There was still life there, still a chance, however slim. She just needed to figure out what to do next, and she needed to figure it out fast. Martha's mind raced through her options as she stood in the warm kitchen, the dying kitten cradled against her chest. She was no veterinarian, had no medical training beyond the basic first aid she had learned raising farm animals decades ago. But she knew people who did, and she knew that every second she spent deliberating was a second this tiny creature could not afford to lose. She reached for the phone mounted on the kitchen wall, the old rotary model she had refused to replace despite her daughter's insistence that she join the modern age, and dialed a number she knew by heart. Dr. Rebecca Chen had been the veterinarian in Sweetwater for almost 20 years, and in that time she had become one of Martha's closest friends. They had met when Martha brought in a wounded hawk she had found by the roadside, and Rebecca had recognized a kindred spirit in the older woman's fierce determination to save a creature that most people would have left to die. Since then, Rebecca had treated every animal that crossed Martha's path, from the obvious cases like Whiskers and Shadow to the more unusual patients that seemed to find their way to the farmhouse with uncanny regularity. The phone rang 3 times before Rebecca's voice came through the line, slightly breathless, as if she had been rushing to answer. Martha spoke quickly, knowing that her words would sound insane, but trusting that Rebecca would understand. She described the bobcat on her porch, the dying kitten, the wounds on the mother's body, and the impossible fact that a wild predator was now standing in her kitchen watching her with desperate golden eyes. There was a long pause when she finished, and Martha braced herself for the questions she knew would come. But Rebecca Chen had not survived 2 decades as a rural veterinarian by being easily surprised. Her voice was calm and professional when she finally responded, asking specific questions about the kitten's breathing, its temperature, its responsiveness to touch. Martha answered as best she could, her free hand gently probing the tiny body for signs of injury or distress. The kitten's heartbeat was rapid and irregular, its body temperature dangerously low, and it showed no response to gentle stimulation of its paws. Rebecca's diagnosis was grim, but not hopeless. The kitten was in shock, possibly from exposure, possibly from trauma, and needed immediate intervention if it was going to survive. Rebecca promised to be there within 30 minutes, instructing Martha to keep the kitten warm and to try to get some sugar water into its system if possible. She also warned Martha to be careful around the mother bobcat, reminding her that wild animals could become unpredictable when their offspring were threatened. Martha thanked her and hung up the phone, turning back to face the situation in her kitchen. The bobcat had settled onto the floor near the wood stove, her body curled in a position that suggested exhaustion as much as watchfulness. The wounds on her hindquarters had stopped bleeding, but Martha could see that they were deep and would need attention. She moved carefully around the wild animal, gathering supplies from her cabinets with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with emergencies before. A small bowl of warm water mixed with honey, an eyedropper salvaged from an old medicine bottle, more clean towels to wrap around the kitten. Whiskers had emerged from his hiding spot and was watching the proceedings from the doorway, his orange tail twitching with nervous energy. Shadow remained hidden, though Martha caught occasional glimpses of green eyes peering out from beneath the couch in the living room. The kitten accepted the sugar water with weak but encouraging movements, its tiny tongue lapping at the drops that Martha carefully placed on its lips. Each swallow seemed to require enormous effort, but the fact that it was swallowing at all gave Martha hope. She settled into a chair near the wood stove, positioning herself close enough to the bobcat to share the warmth, but far enough to avoid appearing threatening. The wildcat watched her with half-closed eyes, her massive paws tucked beneath her body, seemingly content to rest now that her kitten was receiving care. Minutes passed in strange companionship, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the animals around her. Martha found herself talking to the bobcat, a rambling monologue about nothing in particular, the same way she talked to Whiskers and Shadow when the loneliness of her empty house became too heavy. She told the wildcat about her husband, about the orchard he had planted, about the winters they had spent together watching snow fall over the mountains. The bobcat listened with an attentiveness that seemed to go beyond mere animal awareness, her ears swiveling to track Martha's voice. She also talked about the day her husband died, something she rarely spoke of even to human friends. It had been a morning much like this one, cold and quiet, the kind of day that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of something. He had gone out to check on the apple trees, worried about frost damage from an unexpected cold snap, and had simply collapsed among the rows he had tended for 30 years. Martha had found him there, peaceful amid the bare branches, as if he had simply decided to lie down and become part of the land he loved. The bobcat made a soft sound, almost sympathetic, and Martha felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time in months. The kitten stirred in her arms, a small movement that broke the spell of memory. Its breathing seemed slightly stronger now, less labored than it had been when she first lifted it from the porch. Martha allowed herself a cautious surge of optimism, knowing that the next few hours would be critical, but feeling for the first time that survival might actually be possible. She offered more sugar water, and the kitten accepted it with growing enthusiasm, its tiny paws beginning to knead against the towel wrapped around it. Outside, the sound of tires on gravel announced Rebecca's arrival. Martha heard the car door slam, followed by hurried footsteps on the porch stairs. She called out a warning about the Bobcat, not wanting her friend to walk unprepared into such an unusual situation. Rebecca's response was characteristically practical, asking whether the animal seemed aggressive and whether Martha felt safe. Martha looked at the wild cat curled by her stove, at the trust implicit in that relaxed posture, and answered honestly. Rebecca Chen stepped through the door with the confident stride of someone accustomed to walking into unpredictable situations. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her veterinary bag hung from one shoulder, well-worn leather that had seen decades of service, and she carried a portable examination kit in her other hand. She paused just inside the doorway, taking in the scene before her with the measured assessment of a trained professional encountering something entirely outside her normal experience. The Bobcat raised her head at the newcomer's entrance, her golden eyes tracking Rebecca's movements with renewed alertness. A low rumble emanated from her chest, not quite a growl, but clearly a warning that she was watching and would act if necessary. Rebecca froze, her body language shifting to something non-threatening, her gaze dropping to avoid direct eye contact with the wild predator. She had dealt with enough animals to know that this moment would determine everything that followed. The Bobcat held her gaze for a long moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision, lowering her head back to her paws with a soft exhale. Martha released a breath she had not realized she was holding. She beckoned Rebecca forward, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, and offered up the bundled kitten for examination. Rebecca set down her bags and accepted the tiny patient with gentle hands, her expression shifting from wariness to professional focus as she assessed the creature's condition. Her fingers probed carefully along the kitten's body, checking for injuries, feeling the rhythm of its heartbeat, noting the temperature of its skin. The kitten mewled weakly at the handling, a sound so small it was barely audible, but to the 3 women in that kitchen it rang like a bell of hope. The mother Bobcat had risen to her feet at the sound of her offspring's cry, her body tense with maternal instinct. But she did not approach, did not interfere, as if she understood that these strange humans were trying to help rather than harm. Martha moved to position herself between Rebecca and the wildcat, not as a barrier but as a bridge, her presence a reassurance to both parties that everything was proceeding as it should. The tension in the room was palpable, a delicate balance that could tip in any direction with a single wrong move. Rebecca's examination was thorough but swift, her years of experience allowing her to gather information with minimal handling. The kitten was severely hypothermic, she reported, its body temperature dangerously below normal levels. There were no obvious external injuries, but the creature's weakness suggested possible internal issues that would require more advanced diagnostics to identify. Most concerning was the kitten's age, which Rebecca estimated at barely 3 weeks old, far too young to survive without its mother's milk and warmth. The fact that it was still alive at all was something of a miracle. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small heating pad designed for neonatal animals, along with a bottle of specialized formula that she kept on hand for emergencies. The heating pad was activated and placed inside a small carrier she had brought, creating a warm nest where the kitten could begin the slow process of temperature recovery. The formula would need to wait until the creature's body temperature stabilized, as feeding a hypothermic animal could cause more harm than good. For now, the priority was warmth and rest. Martha watched these preparations with anxious attention, asking questions that revealed both her ignorance and her determination to learn. Rebecca answered patiently, explaining the physiology of hypothermia in young animals, the dangers of rewarming too quickly, the signs to watch for that would indicate improvement or decline. She also addressed the elephant in the room, or rather the bobcat, noting that the mother's wounds would need treatment as well if she was willing to accept it. The scratches were deep enough to risk infection, and a weakened mother would be unable to care for whatever other kittens she might have waiting somewhere in the wild. The mention of other kittens brought a new urgency to the situation. If the mother had brought only this one to Martha's door, It meant there were likely more somewhere out there, possibly injured, certainly vulnerable. Rebecca voiced what all of them were thinking. They needed to find the den, needed to assess the condition of any surviving siblings, needed to understand what had happened to cause such desperate circumstances. But first, they needed to stabilize the patients they already had, and they needed to earn the trust of a wild animal who had already extended more faith than anyone could reasonably expect. The bobcat had been watching Rebecca work with an intensity that bordered on unsettling. Her golden eyes tracked every movement, every tool, every gesture, as if memorizing the procedures for future reference. When Rebecca approached her with antiseptic and bandages, she tensed but did not flee, allowing the veterinarian to examine her wounds with only minimal growling protests. The scratches were indeed deep, clearly inflicted by claws rather than teeth, suggesting an encounter with another predator rather than prey fighting back. Rebecca cleaned them carefully, applying antibiotic ointment and loose bandages that the bobcat would probably remove within hours, but that would at least prevent immediate infection. Throughout the treatment, Martha kept up her quiet monologue, her voice a soothing presence that seemed to calm both the wild cat and the nervous domestic cats still watching from their hiding spots. She talked about the weather, about the apple harvest, about the way the mountains looked in winter when snow covered everything in white silence. She talked about the first time she had seen a bobcat, decades ago when she was barely more than a girl, how she had watched it move through the forest with a grace that had seemed almost supernatural. The bobcat listened, her ears swiveling toward Martha's voice, and gradually the tension drained from her powerful body. Rebecca finished her work and sat back on her heels, surveying the scene with an expression of bemused wonder. In 20 years of veterinary practice, she had never experienced anything quite like this morning. She had treated countless wild animals, had even worked with bobcats in rehabilitation settings, but she had never seen one voluntarily enter a human dwelling and submit to treatment. Whatever bond had formed between Martha and this wild mother, it was something special, something that defied the usual rules governing interactions between species. She told Martha as much, her voice soft with respect. The morning sun had risen fully by the time Rebecca finished her initial treatments, casting warm light through Martha's kitchen windows and illuminating the strange tableau within. The kitten rested in its heated carrier, its breathing noticeably stronger than it had been an hour before, while the mother bobcat dozed fitfully near the wood stove with fresh bandages wrapped around her hindquarters. Whiskers had finally emerged from hiding and was perched on the kitchen counter, watching the proceedings with the superior air of a cat who had seen everything and was no longer impressed. Shadow remained beneath the couch, her green eyes occasionally catching the light when she shifted position. Rebecca accepted a cup of coffee from Martha, both women settling into chairs at the kitchen table where they could monitor their patients while discussing the situation. The immediate crisis had passed, but larger questions remained unanswered. Where had the mother bobcat come from? What had attacked her? And most pressing of all, where were the rest of her kittens? Rebecca estimated that a healthy bobcat litter typically contained 2 to 4 kittens, meaning there could be others out there possibly injured, certainly in need of their mother's care. The fact that she had brought only the weakest one suggested the others might be in a safer location, but safe was a relative term in the wilderness. Martha voiced the thought that had been forming in her mind since the bobcat first appeared on her porch. She believed the mother would lead them to her den if they followed her, the same way she had led them to understand her need for help. It was a crazy idea, she acknowledged, the kind of thing that belonged in children's stories rather than real life. But everything about this morning had belonged in children's stories, and Martha had learned long ago that reality often exceeded imagination in its capacity for wonder. Rebecca considered the proposal with the seriousness it deserved, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. The decision was ultimately made by the bobcat herself. As if sensing the direction of their conversation, she rose from her spot by the stove and padded toward the door, pausing to look back at Martha with an expression that needed no translation. She was ready to move, ready to return to wherever she had come from, and she was inviting Martha to follow. The kitten in the carrier made a small sound, and the mother's ears swiveled toward it. her golden eyes softening with an emotion that transcended species. She chirped softly, a reassurance that seemed directed at both her offspring and the humans who had taken it in. Martha did not hesitate. She pulled on her heavy coat and boots, ignoring Rebecca's protests about the dangers of following a wild predator into unknown territory. She had not survived 67 years by being reckless, she reminded her friend, but she had also not survived by turning away from things that mattered. This bobcat had trusted her with her dying kitten, had submitted to treatment from strange hands, had bridged a gap that should have been unbridgeable. The least Martha could do was trust her in return. Rebecca, recognizing the futility of argument, insisted on coming along, her veterinary bag restocked and ready for whatever they might find. They left the kitten in its heated carrier, warm and stable for now, with instructions for Martha to call her daughter to come watch over it if they were gone too long. Whiskers and Shadow were given extra food and fresh water, their curious eyes following the strange procession as it moved toward the door. The bobcat waited on the porch, her patience seemingly infinite, until both women had emerged and closed the door behind them. Then she turned and began to walk, her spotted form moving with painful slowness across the yard toward the tree line at the edge of Martha's property. The forest swallowed them within minutes, the familiar landscape of Martha's home giving way to wilder territory. She had walked these woods countless times over the decades, knew every trail and landmark within a mile of her house, but the bobcat was leading them in a direction she rarely traveled. The terrain grew rougher as they progressed, the ground rising toward the rocky outcroppings that marked the beginning of the true mountain wilderness. Dead leaves crunched beneath their boots, and bare branches reached toward the gray sky like skeletal fingers. The bobcat maintained her steady pace despite her injuries, occasionally pausing to ensure her human followers were still behind her. Rebecca kept close to Martha, her eyes scanning the forest for potential threats while her mind cataloged the medical supplies she had brought. She had treated wild animals in field conditions before, had performed emergency surgeries in barns and clearings when transportation to her clinic was not possible. But she had never done so while being led by a wild bobcat through unfamiliar terrain, and the surreal nature of the situation kept threatening to overwhelm her professional detachment. She focused on the practical concerns, the tangible realities of medicine and biology, pushing aside the questions about animal intelligence and interspecies communication that would keep her awake for many nights to come. The bobcat led them along a route that seemed designed for concealment, following creek beds and rocky passages where their scent would be difficult to track. Martha recognized this as predator behavior, the instinctive caution of an animal that knew it was being hunted as well as hunter. Whatever had attacked the mother and her kittens was likely still out there, and the bobcat was taking no chances with her newfound allies. This realization sent a chill down Martha's spine that had nothing to do with the November cold. They were walking into a situation they did not fully understand, following a guide whose motives they could only guess at. After nearly an hour of hiking, the bobcat stopped at the base of a large granite outcropping. Massive boulders had tumbled together over millennia, creating a maze of crevices and hollows that would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for them. The mother sniffed the air, her ears rotating like satellite dishes, then slipped into a narrow opening between two rocks. Martha and Rebecca exchanged glances, each seeing their own uncertainty reflected in the other's eyes. The opening was barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through, and whatever waited on the other side remained completely hidden from view. Martha took a deep breath and followed. The passage through the rocks was tighter than Martha had anticipated, rough stones scraping against her coat as she squeezed through the narrow opening. The air changed as she moved deeper, becoming warmer and carrying the unmistakable scent of animals, a musky odor that spoke of fur and milk and the close quarters of a den. Dim light filtered through cracks in the rock above, creating a twilight atmosphere that her eyes slowly adjusted to. After what felt like an eternity of careful navigation, the passage opened into a small chamber, and Martha found herself staring at a scene that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The den was a natural formation, a pocket in the granite roughly 10 feet across and perhaps 6 feet high at its center. Dried leaves and grass had been gathered into a nest against one wall, and it was here that the full tragedy of the Bobcat situation revealed itself. 2 more kittens lay in the nest, their small bodies curled together for warmth. One was clearly dead, its form stiff and still, the spotted fur already beginning to lose its luster. The other was alive but barely, its breathing shallow and irregular, its eyes closed against a world that had proven far too harsh for something so young and small. Martha heard Rebecca squeeze through the passage behind her, heard the sharp intake of breath as the veterinarian took in the scene. The mother bobcat had moved to the nest and was nosing her surviving kitten, making soft sounds that might have been encouragement or grief or some feline emotion that had no human equivalent. The dead kitten she ignored with a practicality that seemed heartless, until Martha remembered that wild animals could not afford sentiment when survival was at stake. Death was simply part of life in the wilderness, accepted without question because questioning changed nothing. Rebecca moved past Martha with professional purpose, kneeling beside the nest to examine the surviving kitten. This one was larger than the one back at Martha's house, probably the firstborn of the litter, but it was suffering from the same hypothermia and weakness. The mother bobcat watched the examination with anxious eyes but did not interfere, her earlier trust apparently extending to this new location. Rebecca worked quickly, wrapping the kitten in an emergency blanket from her bag and checking its vital signs with practiced efficiency. The news was cautiously optimistic. This kitten was in better shape than its sibling, probably because its larger size had helped it retain body heat longer. As Rebecca worked, Martha surveyed the den more carefully, trying to piece together what had happened here. The nest showed signs of disturbance, the carefully gathered materials scattered in places, as if something had torn through them. Dark stains on the rock floor might have been blood, though the dim light made it difficult to tell for certain. Near the entrance to the chamber, she found what she was looking for: tracks in the soft dirt, large paw prints that did not belong to a bobcat. Her blood ran cold as she recognized their shape. Coyotes, at least 3 of them based on the overlapping prints, had found this den. The attack must have happened sometime in the night, Martha reasoned, while the mother was away hunting. Coyotes were opportunistic predators, and a den full of helpless kittens would have been an irresistible target. The mother had returned to find her family under siege, had fought off the attackers with the ferocity that only a mother protecting her young could muster, but not before damage had been done. 1 kitten dead, 2 dying, and the mother herself injured in the battle. It was a miracle any of them had survived at all, and it was desperation that had driven her to seek help from the one place her instincts told her she might find it. Rebecca had stabilized the second kitten and was preparing it for transport, her movements efficient despite the awkward conditions. She told Martha that they needed to get both surviving kittens to her clinic, where she had proper equipment to treat them. The mother would need to come too, both for continued treatment of her wounds and because the kittens would need her milk if they were to have any chance of survival. It was an unprecedented situation, bringing a wild bobcat family into a veterinary clinic. But Rebecca had never been one to let conventions stand in the way of saving lives. The question was whether the mother would cooperate. She had trusted them thus far, had led them to her den, and allowed them to handle her offspring, but following them to an unfamiliar location filled with strange smells and sounds was another matter entirely. Martha approached the bobcat slowly, speaking in the same soothing tones she had used all morning, explaining what they needed to do, even though she knew the animal could not understand her words. What mattered was the intent behind them, the emotional content that transcended language. She was asking for trust one more time, asking a wild creature to extend her faith even further into unknown territory. The bobcat studied Martha with those golden eyes, and something passed between them that neither could have explained. It was not communication in any conventional sense, not the exchange of information that language allowed, but something older and more fundamental. 2 mothers, 1 human and 1 wild, recognizing in each other the same fierce determination to protect the young ones in their care. The bobcat rose to her feet and moved toward the entrance of the den, pausing to look back at Martha with an expression that seemed almost like resignation. She would follow them wherever they needed to go. She had come too far to turn back now. The journey back through the forest was slower than the journey out, burdened now with 2 kitten patients and the growing exhaustion of everyone involved. Rebecca carried the second kitten in its emergency blanket, her veterinary bag slung across her back, while Martha helped guide the injured mother along the gentlest possible route. The sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its descent toward the western ridges, casting long shadows through the bare trees. They emerged from the woods as the afternoon light turned golden, Martha's farmhouse a welcome sight after hours in the wilderness. The first kitten had improved dramatically during their absence, Martha discovered with overwhelming relief when she checked the heated carrier in her kitchen. Her daughter Emily had arrived an hour earlier, summoned by a frantic phone call that had required considerable explanation before she agreed to drive out from town. Emily Jennings Cooper was 42 years old, a high school teacher with her mother's practical nature and her father's stubborn skepticism, and she had spent most of her time at the farmhouse convinced that Martha had finally succumbed to the isolation and eccentricity that everyone had always predicted would claim her eventually. But seeing was believing, and Emily could not deny the evidence of her own eyes. A wild bobcat sat in her mother's kitchen, watching with golden eyes as 2 strange women fussed over a pair of impossibly small kittens. The domestic cats had apparently made their peace with the intruder, Whiskers going so far as to settle on the floor a few feet from the wild predator with the air of a host grudgingly accepting an unexpected house guest. Shadow had finally emerged from beneath the couch and was perched on the kitchen counter, her green eyes following the activity with feline inscrutability. It was, Emily admitted to her mother in a stunned whisper, the most extraordinary thing she had ever witnessed. Rebecca had called ahead to her clinic, instructing her assistant to prepare the isolation ward for unusual patients. The Sweetwater Veterinary Clinic was not equipped for wildlife rehabilitation, but Rebecca had accumulated specialized equipment over the years for exactly these kinds of situations. The isolation ward had a separate heating system, specialized enclosures that could accommodate wild animals safely, and most importantly, privacy from the curious eyes of regular clients who might not understand why their small-town vet was treating a family of bobcats. The drive would take about 20 minutes, and Rebecca wanted to get the kittens under proper medical supervision as soon as possible. The logistics of transporting a wild bobcat and her offspring proved challenging, but not insurmountable. The mother was clearly exhausted, her earlier alertness giving way to a heavy-lidded fatigue that spoke of days without proper rest. She allowed herself to be guided into the large dog carrier that Emily had retrieved from Martha's barn, settling onto the blanket inside with a sigh that seemed almost human in its weariness. The 2 kittens were placed in smaller carriers, their condition stable but still requiring careful monitoring. Martha insisted on riding in the back of Rebecca's van with the animals, unwilling to break the connection that had formed between herself and the desperate mother who had sought her help. The drive to the clinic passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional soft sounds from the carriers and Rebecca's murmured reassurances that they were almost there. Emily followed in her own car, still struggling to process everything she had witnessed and heard over the past few hours. She'd grown up in these mountains, had spent her childhood exploring the same forests that had produced today's miracle, and she had never imagined that such a thing was possible. Wild animals did not seek help from humans. They did not lead people to their dens or submit to medical treatment with patient resignation. And yet, here she was, following a van that contained exactly that impossibility, her entire understanding of the natural world shifting beneath her feet. The clinic was quiet when they arrived, Rebecca's assistant Maria having cleared the afternoon appointments with vague explanations about an emergency situation. Maria was a young woman from the local community college's veterinary technician program, eager and competent, and her eyes went wide when she saw what emerged from the van. She had assisted with wildlife cases before, injured deer and orphaned raccoons and the occasional hawk with a broken wing. But a bobcat family was something else entirely. She recovered quickly, her training taking over, and helped transfer the patients to the prepared isolation ward with professional efficiency. The next several hours were a blur of medical procedures and careful monitoring. Rebecca worked with focused intensity, running blood tests and administering fluids, checking vital signs and adjusting treatments based on the results. The kittens responded well to the warm environment and proper nutrition, their small bodies proving more resilient than their fragile appearance suggested. The mother bobcat accepted additional treatment of her wounds without protest, though she refused to rest until she could see both her offspring settled safely nearby. Only when the kittens were arranged in a heated enclosure within her line of sight did she finally allow herself to sleep, her spotted body curling into a position that spoke of utter exhaustion. Martha refused to leave. She sat in a chair in the corner of the isolation ward, watching over the bobcat family with the same fierce protectiveness she had felt since the moment a wild mother had placed her dying kitten at her feet. Emily had tried to convince her to go home and rest, pointing out that Rebecca and Maria were more than capable of handling things, but Martha would not be moved. She had made a promise, she explained, even if it had never been spoken aloud. She had accepted responsibility for these creatures when she opened her door that morning, and she would not abandon them now. Emily recognized the look in her mother's eyes and knew better than to argue further. As evening settled over Sweetwater, Rebecca finally allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. Both kittens were stable, their temperatures normalized and their breathing strong. The mother's wound showed no signs of infection, and she had accepted food and water when offered. Against all reasonable expectations, this wild family had survived a journey from the brink of death to something approaching safety. There would be challenges ahead, Rebecca warned Martha, as they shared a quiet cup of coffee in the clinic's small break room. The kittens would need weeks of careful rehabilitation before they could be considered out of danger. The mother's injuries would take time to heal completely, and the larger question of what to do with them once they recovered remained unanswered. Martha listened to all of this with patient attention, nodding at the appropriate moments and asking questions that revealed her determination to understand every aspect of the situation. But her response to Rebecca's concerns was simple and unwavering. They would figure it out together, she said, one day at a time. That was how she had survived everything life had thrown at her, from her husband's death to the loneliness of the years that followed. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm of feeding schedules, medical checkups, and quiet hours spent watching the bobcat family slowly regain their strength. Martha divided her time between her farmhouse and the clinic, unable to stay away from the creatures whose lives had become so unexpectedly intertwined with her own. Whiskers and Shadow seemed to understand her absence, greeting her returns with an equanimity that suggested they too had been changed by the events of that November morning. The farmhouse felt different now, charged with a significance it had not possessed before, as if the bobcat's presence had awakened something dormant in its old walls. The kittens grew stronger with each passing day, their recovery exceeding even Rebecca's cautious expectations. The smaller one, the runt who had been carried to Martha's door in its mother's jaws, proved to have a fighter's spirit that belied its fragile appearance. Martha had taken to calling it Hope, a name that Rebecca initially protested as too sentimental for a wild animal, but eventually adopted herself. The larger kitten, whom Maria had dubbed Scout for its curious nature and tendency to explore every corner of its enclosure, developed a bold personality that suggested it would thrive when eventually returned to the wild. Together, the siblings played and wrestled and practiced the hunting behaviors that would one day mean the difference between survival and starvation. The mother bobcat, whom Martha simply called Mama, healed more slowly than her offspring. The wounds from the coyote attack had been deep, and infection had set in despite Rebecca's best efforts, requiring a course of antibiotics that left the wildcat lethargic and irritable. But she endured the treatment with the same stoic patience she had shown since the beginning, seeming to understand that the strange procedures were necessary even if they were unpleasant. Her golden eyes followed Martha whenever the older woman was present, tracking her movements with an attention that spoke of recognition and something that might have been gratitude. Word of the unusual patients at Sweetwater Veterinary Clinic spread through the community with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. Rebecca had tried to maintain discretion, But Maria had mentioned the situation to her boyfriend, who told his mother, who worked at the grocery store and was constitutionally incapable of keeping secrets. Within a week, half the town knew that old Martha Jennings had somehow befriended a wild bobcat, and opinions ranged from admiration to concern to outright disbelief. The local newspaper sent a reporter to investigate, a young man named David Chin, who happened to be Rebecca's nephew, and who promised to handle the story with appropriate sensitivity. The article that appeared in the Sweetwater Gazette was thoughtful and restrained, focusing on the unusual circumstances of the rescue, rather than sensationalizing the relationship between Martha and Mama. David had interviewed Martha at length, listening with genuine interest as she described that November morning and everything that had followed. He had also spoken with Rebecca, who provided the medical context and emphasized the exceptional nature of the bobcat's behavior. The story struck a chord with readers, many of whom reached out to offer support, donations for the animal's care, and their own stories of unexpected connections with wildlife. Martha found herself overwhelmed by the response, unused to attention after so many years of quiet solitude. Among those who contacted Martha was Dr. Helen Reyes, a wildlife biologist from the University of Tennessee who specialized in bobcat behavior. Helen had read David's article with professional skepticism, her scientific training making her wary of anthropomorphizing wild animals. But something about the story had intrigued her enough to make the 3-hour drive to Sweetwater. She arrived at the clinic on a gray December afternoon, her credentials impeccable and her curiosity evident, prepared to debunk what she assumed was an exaggerated tale of human-animal bonding. What she found instead challenged everything she thought she knew about bobcat behavior. Mama's response to Martha was unlike anything Helen had observed in decades of field research. The wildcat showed clear signs of recognition and positive association, behaviors that were well documented in domesticated animals, but extraordinarily rare in wild felids. Even more surprising was Mama's tolerance of other humans in Martha's presence, a level of socialization that should have been impossible without extensive conditioning from a young age. Helen spent 3 days observing and documenting, her initial skepticism gradually giving way to scientific wonder. The explanation she eventually proposed was both simple and profound. Mama had almost certainly encountered humans before, probably as a young cat exploring the edges of civilization where wilderness met development. These encounters had apparently been positive enough to create a baseline of tolerance that most wild bobcats never developed. When crisis struck and her kittens' lives hung in the balance, some combination of desperation and that early conditioning had driven her to seek help from the one source she associated with potential safety. It was not magic or mysticism, Helen emphasized, but it was remarkable nonetheless, a testament to the cognitive flexibility of wild animals and the unexpected ways that human and animal worlds could intersect. Martha listened to Helen's explanation with the patient attention she gave to all things, nodding at the scientific reasoning while privately holding on to her own interpretation of events. She did not disagree with the biologist's conclusions, which seemed logical and well supported by evidence. But she also believed that something deeper had passed between herself and Mama that morning on the porch, something that transcended the clinical language of behavioral conditioning and survival instinct. Call it connection, call it understanding, call it whatever name made sense to the person using it. Martha knew what she had felt, and no amount of scientific explanation could diminish its significance. As December progressed and the holidays approached, the question of the bobcat family's future became increasingly pressing. The kittens were nearly weaned now, healthy and active and showing all the signs of wild animals ready to return to their natural habitat. Mama's wounds had healed completely, leaving scars beneath her fur that would serve as permanent reminders of her desperate journey. Rebecca had contacts with wildlife rehabilitation centers that could facilitate a proper release, ensuring the family was returned to suitable territory with appropriate monitoring. Everything was in place for a happy ending to an extraordinary story. But Martha found herself struggling with emotions she had not anticipated. She had known from the beginning that this arrangement was temporary, that wild animals belonged in the wild, and that keeping them would be both illegal and cruel. She had told herself repeatedly that the goal was recovery and release, that her role was caretaker rather than owner. And yet the thought of saying goodbye to Mama, of watching those golden eyes disappear into the forest forever, created an ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. The release date was set for December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, when weather forecasts predicted a mild spell that would give the Bobcat family optimal conditions for their return to the wild. Dr. Helen Reyes had identified a suitable release site in the Cherokee National Forest, far enough from human habitation to minimize future conflicts, but within the natural range for bobcats in the region. She had also arranged for tracking collars to be fitted on all 3 animals, small GPS units that would allow researchers to monitor their progress and ensure they successfully reintegrated into their natural habitat. Everything was proceeding according to protocol, professional and proper, and utterly heartbreaking. Martha spent the days leading up to the release in a state of emotional preparation that felt inadequate to the task ahead. She visited the clinic every morning and evening, sitting with Mama and the kittens, talking to them in the soft voice that had become their shared language. Hope and Scout had grown dramatically in the weeks since their rescue, their spotted coats glossy with health, their movements quick and confident as they practiced the stalking behaviors that would soon mean survival. They showed less attachment to Martha than their mother did, which was exactly as it should be, their wild instincts properly intact despite their time in captivity. Mama, however, continued to respond to Martha's presence with an attentiveness that made the upcoming separation even harder to contemplate. Emily visited her mother frequently during this period, concerned about the toll that the impending release was taking on Martha's emotional state. She had watched her mother transform over the past several weeks, the quiet grief that had characterized her life since her father's death, giving way to a vitality and purpose that Emily had not seen in years. The Bobcat family had given Martha something to care for, something to focus on beyond the empty rooms and fading memories of the farmhouse. Emily worried about what would happen when that focus was removed, when the clinic visits ended and the ordinary loneliness of rural life reasserted itself. But Martha surprised her daughter, as she had surprised everyone who underestimated the resilience that decades of mountain living had instilled. She acknowledged the difficulty of what lay ahead, admitted freely that she would miss Mama and the kittens with an intensity that bordered on grief. But she also spoke of the privilege of having been part of their story, of having been chosen by a wild mother to help save her family. That experience could not be taken away by distance or time. It had become part of who Martha was, woven into the fabric of her identity, alongside all the other moments that had shaped her life. She would carry it forward, she told Emily, not as a burden, but as a gift. The morning of December 23rd dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the fields around Martha's farmhouse like scattered diamonds. She rose before the sun, as she always did, and made her coffee in the old percolator, while Whiskers and Shadow wound around her ankles with their usual demands. The routine felt different today, weighted with significance that transformed ordinary actions into something approaching ritual. She fed her cats, washed her cup, and dressed in layers appropriate for a day spent in the forest. Then she drove to the clinic for the last time, her heart heavy, but her resolve firm. Rebecca and Helen were already there when Martha arrived, along with Maria and a team from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Network that would assist with the transport and release. The isolation ward had been transformed into a staging area, carriers and equipment arranged with military precision, everyone moving with the focused efficiency of people who understood the importance of their task. Mama watched the preparations from her enclosure, her golden eyes alert but calm, as if she understood that something significant was about to happen. The kittens played nearby, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, their innocent energy a counterpoint to the somber mood of the humans around them. The sedation process was quick and humane, administered by Rebecca with the gentle expertise that characterized all her work. Mama accepted the injection with minimal resistance, her eyes finding Martha's face and holding there until the medication took effect. The kittens were sedated next, their small bodies going limp within minutes, peaceful in their chemically induced sleep. Tracking collars were fitted, vital signs checked one final time, and then the family was loaded into transport carriers for the journey to their new home. Martha helped with every step, needing to be part of the process until the very end. The drive to Cherokee National Forest took nearly 2 hours, winding through mountain roads that grew increasingly remote as they left civilization behind. Martha rode in the back of the transport van again, sitting beside Mama's carrier, her hand resting against the wire mesh where she could feel the slow rhythm of the sedated cat's breathing. She talked quietly throughout the journey, telling Mama about the forest they were going to, about the prey that waited there, about the territory she would claim, and the life she would build. Whether the bobcat could hear her or understand was irrelevant. The words were as much for Martha as for anyone else. The release site was a clearing in a valley surrounded by forested ridges, remote and wild and perfect for a bobcat family starting over. Helen had scouted the location personally, confirming the presence of suitable prey species and the absence of competing predators. A small stream provided fresh water, and rocky outcroppings offered numerous potential den sites. It was, everyone agreed, an ideal place for Mama and her kittens to begin their new chapter. The team unloaded the carriers and positioned them at the edge of the clearing, facing the forest that would become their home. The reversal agents were administered, and the waiting began. Mama woke first, her golden eyes blinking open with the confusion that always followed sedation. She lay still for several minutes, her nose working as she processed the unfamiliar scents around her, her ears swiveling to catch sounds that had been absent from her life for weeks. Then she rose unsteadily to her feet, her body remembering its strength even as her mind struggled to catch up. She looked at Martha, who stood nearby with tears streaming down her weathered face, and made a sound that might have been farewell. The carrier door swung open, and Mama stepped out into the wild world she had been born to inhabit. Her movements were tentative at first, muscles stiff from confinement and sedation, but with each step, her confidence grew. She paused at the edge of the clearing, her spotted coat catching the winter sunlight, and turned to look back at the assembled humans one final time. Her golden eyes found Martha's face across the distance between them, and for a long moment neither moved. Then Mama made that soft chirping sound that Martha had come to know so well, a vocalization that seemed to carry everything that could not be expressed in any other way. Hope and Scout emerged from their carriers moments later, their young bodies recovering from sedation more quickly than their mothers had. They bounded into the clearing with the exuberance of youth, immediately beginning to explore their new surroundings with curious noses and alert ears. Mama watched them with the patient vigilance of motherhood, allowing them their freedom while remaining ready to intervene if danger appeared. When Hope ventured too close to the tree line, she called out with a sharp sound that brought the kitten back to her side. Some lessons transcended location, Martha thought, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. The family lingered in the clearing longer than Helen had expected, perhaps adjusting to the overwhelming sensory input of the wild after weeks in the controlled environment of the clinic. Mama groomed both kittens methodically, her rough tongue smoothing their fur and reinforcing the bonds that would hold them together through the challenges ahead. Scout attempted to stalk a fallen leaf, his hunting instincts already asserting themselves, while Hope climbed onto a low rock and surveyed the surrounding forest with an expression that seemed almost regal. They were wild animals returning to wildness, Martha reminded herself, exactly as they should be. When Mama finally led her kittens into the forest, she did not look back again. One moment they were there, 3 spotted forms against the winter-brown landscape, and the next they had vanished into the undergrowth as completely as if they had never existed. The silence that followed their departure was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through bare branches and the distant call of a crow. Martha stood motionless, staring at the place where Mama had disappeared, feeling the finality of the moment settle over her like a physical weight. Rebecca appeared at her side, one hand resting gently on Martha's shoulder. No words were necessary between them, no platitudes about happy endings or the rightness of wild things remaining wild. They simply stood together in the cold December clearing, 2 women who had shared an extraordinary experience and who understood that some moments defied easy categorization. Helen and her team began packing up the equipment, their movements quiet and respectful, giving Martha the space she needed to process her emotions. The drive back to Sweetwater was silent, Martha lost in thoughts that ranged across the entire span of her life. She thought about her husband, about the love they had shared and the hole his absence had left in her world. She thought about the years of loneliness that had followed, the gradual shrinking of her existence until it fit entirely within the boundaries of her farmhouse and the surrounding fields. And she thought about Mama, about a wild mother who had crossed those boundaries with desperate courage and had, in doing so, reminded Martha that life still held the capacity for wonder. Emily was waiting at the farmhouse when Martha arrived, a pot of soup warming on the stove and a fire crackling in the hearth. Whiskers and Shadow greeted their returning human with meows of indignation at her prolonged absence, winding around her ankles until she bent to scratch their ears. The familiar routines of home enveloped Martha like a warm blanket, their comfort undeniable, even as she felt the fresh wound of Mama's departure. She ate the soup her daughter had made, answered questions about the release, and eventually found herself sitting in her favorite chair by the window as darkness fell outside. The weeks that followed brought regular updates from Helen's tracking program. Mama had established a territory in the valley where she had been released, marking its boundaries with the scent posts that defined Bobcat real estate. Hope and Scout remained with her through the winter, learning the skills they would need to survive on their own. By spring, Scout had begun ranging farther from his mother, the independence natural to young male bobcats asserting itself. Hope stayed closer, her smaller size perhaps making her more cautious, though Helen's data showed she was becoming an accomplished hunter in her own right. Martha followed these reports with devoted attention, each update a small gift that connected her to creatures she would likely never see again. She had resumed her regular life, the rhythms of the farmhouse continuing much as they had before that November morning, but something fundamental had changed. She joined the local wildlife conservation group, lending her voice to efforts to protect bobcat habitat in the region. She began volunteering at a nearby nature center, sharing her experience with visitors who were fascinated by the story of the wild mother who had sought human help. The loneliness that had defined her existence for so long did not disappear entirely, but it was tempered now by connection and purpose. 1 year after the release, on another cold November morning, Martha was sitting in her chair by the window when movement at the edge of her property caught her attention. A bobcat stood at the tree line, its spotted coat vivid against the brown autumn landscape. It was too far away for Martha to identify with certainty, too distant for her aging eyes to confirm what her heart desperately wanted to believe. But as she watched, the bobcat turned toward the farmhouse and stood motionless for a long moment, as if regarding something of significance before continuing on its way. Martha never knew if it was Mama returning to check on the human who had helped save her family, or simply another bobcat passing through territory that had always belonged to its kind. Perhaps it did not matter. What mattered was the reminder that the wild world continued beyond her windows, beautiful and brutal, and forever capable of surprise. She raised her coffee cup in silent salute as the bobcat disappeared into the forest, carrying with it the memory of a desperate morning when two mothers from different worlds had found each other and discovered that compassion knew no boundaries,